Welcome to Lecture 7 in International Trade Theory and Policy. The topic of this lecture is external economies of scale. So, first of all, a usual little review of what we did the last time, which was before the break. So we sort of look at the standard trade model, which can be seen as sort of sort of encompassing, all the different models, Ricardian, fixed factors, and Heckscher all in that we studied in the course. We saw, and we focus on sort of three aspects of the model, which we hadn't done before. So first of all, the impact of growth. So we saw that export bias growth reduces a country's terms of trade and welfare. So we saw that import bias growth increases a country terms of trade and welfare. We look at international borrowing and lending as a intertemporal trade, and then we look at the impact of labor migration on and wage equalization. So the main objectives of Lecture 7 is to introduce a new element to the picture, so to recognize that international trade often takes place because of the presence of increasing returns to scale. We will distinguish external from internal economies of scale, and we're going to see sort of the difference implications of the two, and this lecture will focus on sources and market structure implications of external economies of scale. So we look at the roles of external economies and knowledge spillover in shaping international trade patterns and the effects on trade on prices and countries' welfare, and we'll see how the presence of external economies might allow us to explain some features of trade as due to historical accidents, and we're also going to see how it can provide some arguments in favor of protectionism. So again, this lecture will focus on external economies of scale. We will talk about internal economies of scale next week in Lecture 8. Okay, so the models of comparative advantage so far have either assumed constant returns to scale, as sort of the case of the Ricardian model. When inputs to an industry increase at a certain rate, output increases at the same rate. So if outputs was double, output would double as well. So remember, in the Ricardian model, there were unit labor requirement which were constant, and how much you sort of produce would depend on the amount of labor available. Double labor in the model, and you would be able to double output. So decreasing returns to scale was, certainly central in the discussion of the specific factors model. When input increases at a certain rate, output increases at a lower rate. So if inputs are double, output would less than double. So economies of scale, or also increasing returns to scale, refers to situations when output increases at a faster rate than input. So if you double your inputs, output more than doubles. So in such a situation, a larger scale is more efficient. So you can view increasing returns to scale as the cost per unit of output decreasing or falling as either the firm or the industry increases output. So, for example, and to make it a little bit more precise, suppose an industry produces output using only one input, labor, so sort of like in the Ricardian model. So the presence of economies of scale might be seen from the fact that if you double the input of labor, the industry output more than doubles. So that's a standard way of defining things. But you can also see as the average amount of labor used to produce each unit of output is less when the industry produces more. So in this picture, for example, you can see how the first column is output. The second column is total labor input needed to produce the output. So you need 10 units of labor to produce 5 units of output. You need 15 to produce 10. You need 20 to produce 15, etc. So see how if you double amount of input from 10 to 20, output increases threefolds in this example. So clearly, there are economies of scale. Now let's look at the third column and see how the third column sort of summarizes the presence of economies of scale. You can compute average labor input by dividing the number dividing the number in the second row by the number in the first row. So average labor input is 2 if you're producing 5 units of output, because that's 10 divided by 5. If you're producing 15, average labor input is 1.5. Again, that is 15 divided by 5. And so on. So you see how this table, if you look at the third column, average labor input is falling, is decreasing as output increases. So that is also a representation of the presence of economies of scale in this either industry or firm. So mutually beneficial trade can arise as a result of economies of scale. So essentially, international trade permits each country to produce, a limited range of goods in larger quantities. So producing in larger quantity means that you're going to be able to produce at a lower average cost. So you're going to, be producing in a sort of more efficient way. And at the same time, the fact that you can trade allows you to do so without sacrificing, variety in consumption. So a country with trade can take advantage of economies of scale to produce more efficiently than if it tried to produce everything for itself. So now the distinction, which I mentioned, between external and internal economies of scale, it is this distinction that is useful because the presence of either external or internal economies of scale has implication for market structure. So economies of scale could mean either larger firms or a larger industry. A larger industry you could imagine as a large number of not necessarily big firms. So external economies occur when the cost per unit of output depends on the size of the industry. Internal economies of scale occurs when the cost per unit of output depends on the size of a firm. So, for example, in steel production, it's reasonable to think that at least in a large initial range, there are internal economies of scale, meaning that there are average cost reduction by concentrating production in a single firm. Now, that sort of is to be distinguished by external economies. So they have got both of them, both external and internal economies of scale are important causes of international trade, but they have, as I said, the reason to distinguish them is that they have different implications for the structure of industry. So an industry with where economies of scale as external could consist, and typically will consist, of many small firms and can be perfectly competitive. So we don't have to worry about firms exercising market power. Internal economies of scale, on the other hand, results when large firms have a cost advantage over small firms, causing the industry to become imperfectly competitive. So we are going. So as I anticipated, this lecture will deal with external economies. Next lecture will cover internal economies of scale. So there are many modern examples of industry that seem to have powerful external economies of scale. So, for example, in the United States, the semiconductor industry is concentrated in Silicon Valley, investment banking in New York, and the entertainment industry in Hollywood. In developing countries such as China, external economies are also pervasive in manufacturing. So there is one town in China that produces most of the world's underwear, another nearly all cigarette lighters. Also, external economies play a key role in India's emergence as a major exporter of information services. So Indian information services companies tend to be clustered in Bangalore. So concentrating production of an industry in one or a few locations can reduce the industry's cost, even if the individual firms in the industry remain small. So there are a variety of reasons why this happens. So the first one is specialization. So the industry may need specialized equipment or services, which are only supplied by other firms if the industry is sort of large and concentrated. So, for example, Silicon Valley in California has a large concentration of silicon chip companies, which are serviced by companies that make special machines for manufacturing silicon chips. So these machines are cheaper and more easily available there than elsewhere. So specialization of equipment and services is one reason. The second reason is labor pooling. So a large and concentrated industry may attract a pool of workers, reducing employee search and hiring cost for each firm. So the large concentration of highly skilled workers, associated with the several top universities nearby, is possibly one of the reasons for explaining again the concentration of technology companies in Silicon Valley. The third reason is knowledge spillovers. So workers from different firms may more easily share ideas that benefit each firm when a large and concentrated industry exists. Okay, so let me stop here to keep these things manageable. So